Welcome everyone from Kansas State University, the host for the Kansas-based Solve Climate by 2030 Power Dialog. I'm going to move us to a slide and introduce Larry Erickson. Larry, you can unmute yourself and I'll move the slides.
This is Larry Erickson. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Solve Climate by 2030 in Kansas. In January 2020, London Economics prepared a report for the state of Kansas and recommended that Kansas develop a state energy plan. If we want to solve climate by 2030, the first step is to develop a plan. This is why the emphasis today is on a climate and energy plan for Kansas. We have good resources as we begin this task. The new book, Reducing Greenhouse Gas Emissions and Improving Air Quality, Two Interrelated Global Challenges, has many good ideas that will be helpful in developing the plan. Kansas also has excellent wind energy and solar energy resources that can be used to generate electricity and used for transportation. Electricity from wind is the lowest cost alternative in Kansas, and the growth of more wind farms is continuing. The Flint Hills Renewable Energy and Efficiency Cooperative has found a good way to reduce the cost of electricity from solar by providing free labor to install solar panels on their members' homes. We are living in a changing times. I am able to drive to the university using electricity to power my plug-in hybrid Prius. When I go down a hill, I am able to charge the battery as the potential energy of my car decreases. The need for a climate and energy plan includes the state of Kansas, counties in Kansas, cities in Kansas, Kansas State University, schools, churches, companies, and organizations such as CEP and the Metropolitan Energy Center that are helping today. Individuals and families need to have a climate and energy plan also. We spend a significant amount on energy and transportation. It is about $9,000 per person per year in the United States. For the people of Kansas, this is about $25 billion per year. Because of climate change, there are more problems with wildfires, flooding, drought, high winds, and high summer temperatures. We need plans to address these issues also. We had $17 million in damages in Manhattan, Kansas because of Wildcat Creek flooding recently. In developing the Kansas Climate and Energy Plan, we should include some goals such as reducing greenhouse gas emissions, improving energy efficiency, and improving air quality. We should review other climate and energy plans and learn from them. I want to thank all who are helping with this program and for all who have joined us this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Here's an outline of how we're going to spend the rest of the time together. I'll be introducing Kansas panelists, and they will each be giving a presentation followed by an opportunity for some question and answer. But I have some suggestions for all of you who are logged on first. Please spend this time using the chat button to register your name, your email, and your affiliation first. In this way, we can monitor who is asking questions, and I will select one or two between each presenter. Use this chat and make sure you're addressing everyone. This is going to be captured, and we'll be able to use questions for follow-up that we're not able to get to during this hour and a half. If you're having any challenges, use Alt-H in order to restore chat screen at any time. And if you get disconnected at any time, you can redial and phone in again. So we'll spend about an hour, 20 minutes with the panelists, and then we'll have breakout room sessions. Here are our panelists, Dorothy Barnett, Tami Alexander, Zack Pistora, Moti Rieber, and Whitney Wilson. Dorothy Barnett is the Executive Director of Climate and Energy Project, and she advocates for clean energy in the heartland. Grounded in solutions-based common sense approach, she successfully convenes diverse voices around renewable energy, water, and efficiency. I'm going to stop the share and let her load hers and proceed. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Well, good evening. I'm excited to join you tonight to discuss how we can solve climate by 2030. As Donna said, I'm Dorothy Barnett, the Executive Director of the Climate and Energy Project. CEP, as we call ourselves, Climate and Energy Project, is a Kansas-based nonprofit that has largely focused on the economic benefits of renewable energy and energy efficiency as solutions that work for Kansas. Our mission has expanded in recent years to address the impacts of climate change on public health and solutions that build community resilience. And I'm having trouble going to the next slide. Let me see there. I'm going to spend my time sharing information about Kansas electricity emissions, utility scale wind, solar, and storage, distributed generation, and the Kansas Energy Plan. Before we can discuss what strategies Kansas can take to reduce emissions, it's important to understand where we are today. Globally, the power sector accounts for about 40% of annual greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere. Of total worldwide electricity generation, fossil fuels represent 67%, nuclear represents 11%, and renewable energy sources are just over 20%, 24% and growing. The bulk of renewable energy generation globally is large hydropower systems. In Kansas, our electric generation includes over 15.5 gigawatts of installed capacity as of the end of 2018, with coal, gas, and wind as the dominant generation fuels and technologies. As of the end of the 2018, coal-fired generation capacity comprised 30% and gas-fired generation was 24%. Wind energy made up 34%, more than 10% higher than the average global use of renewable energy. The Kansas wind industry is a major economic driver for our state. By the end of this year, Kansas will have 34 operating wind farms with an additional 10 projects under development in 26 counties. When fully developed, operating wind farms and those under development will represent over 8,000 megawatts of wind energy, varying in size from a 4 megawatt project at Fort Hays State University to the 470 megawatt Flat Ridge 2 project, which spans 4 counties. In addition to job creation and billions of dollars in investment, the wind industry invests heavily in local communities, providing significant revenue in the form of property, state, and local taxes, lease payments, and donations to schools and communities. Additionally, wind energy has been a key factor in our state's declining carbon emissions, avoiding more than 9 million metric tons of carbon annually. Our power sector emissions have reduced more than 40% over the past 20 years, primarily due to our investments in wind. Emissions from our transportation and our industry sectors were relatively stable until the recent coronavirus outbreak. Despite a top 10 solar resource with more sunny days than Florida, Kansas has just under 30 megawatts of installed solar power. Market projections indicate utility PV capacity will more than double in the next 5 years. If we're going to mitigate emissions and build a more equitable power system that can help our state become more resilient in the face of a changing climate, we must do more than generate and store clean energy. The recent International Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, report warned that to keep global warming under 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is what the Paris Climate Accord requires, human-caused emissions of carbon will have to fall to 0 by 2050. Since CO2 emissions build up in the atmosphere and remain there for centuries, carbon emissions from coal plants need to be cut in half by 2030 from 2016 levels. We must not only rely on additional clean energy investments in utility-scale wind, solar, and distributed generation, but we must also close our remaining coal plants by 2030. Up until this year, battery storage was considered the future of energy. But in the last months of 2019, 8 major US battery storage projects advanced or signed contracts to sell energy from their facilities to major utilities, signaling the future of battery storage might be closer than we originally expected. This growth is being driven by increasing electricity prices and grid stability. Commercial business owners who are looking to improve their bottom lines are doing so by generating and now storing their own energy. Energy storage can help curb climate change by decreasing emissions from electricity, heating, and cooling. According to the U.S. Energy Information Agency, utility-scale battery storage capacity in the U.S. could more than double within 2 years. With our robust wind and solar resources, Kansas is poised to see exponential growth in utility-scale batteries. For the past 15 years, CEP has promoted utility-scale wind and now solar energy as the fastest, most economical way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We stand by that early decision as we continue to see exponential emission reductions from wind power. However, the timeline for climate action is short, and we need to not only utility-scale generation, but local generation as well. As the cost of rooftop solar and other distributed technologies continue to be more economical, and we see technology changing before our eyes, CEP and our partners continue to push for policies through our Clean Energy Business Council to allow for a more decentralized and modern grid. Kansas needs to be able to take actions to make homes and communities more resilient. The Institute for Local Self-Reliance gives Kansas an F on their 2020 Community Power Scorecard. Imagine an energy system built from the bottom up rather than from the top down. Efficient housing stock needs less power to heat or cool. Some of that could be provided by on-site distributed resources or neighborhood generation. If we use on-site and local resources to optimize our electricity demand, smart homes with smart meters, and allow Kansans to generate some of their own power, we can shift energy demand and store excess power that can be used when and where it's needed most. The way we have developed energy production is upside down. Utilities are incentivized to suppress the very thing that we should be building: small and medium scale distributed generation and energy efficiency. The current utility business model does not support the energy system we need to mitigate power sector emissions. We must have leadership at all levels come together and make this transformational shift. Energy efficiency is the use of less energy to provide the same or better products, services, or amenities. Increasing efficiency allows more control over energy use. It lowers cost and provides multiple benefits to households, businesses, and the environment. For example, adding insulation to the home improves both efficiency and comfort. Increasing the efficiency of a manufacturing process can enhance the competitiveness of the plant. And by lowering energy use, all forms of energy efficiency cut pollution. The American Council for an Energy Efficiency Economy ranks Kansas 46th out of 50 states for investments in energy efficiency. We can and we must do better. To solve climate by 2030, Kansas needs a comprehensive approach to address the transforming energy environment. A recent report to the Kansas legislature lists the establishment of a state energy plan as one of the top priorities the state should embark on to help achieve regionally competitive electricity rates. With technology advancements rapidly changing our energy options, it's important that Kansas adapts its rate making to provide customers with affordable energy choices. A state energy plan will establish guiding principles, realistic objectives, and actionable strategies to guide Kansas in its near-term and long-term energy decisions for years to come. Fortunately, many of our state's leaders recognize the need for planning and strategies to keep Kansas healthy and resilient. With Governor Kelly's announcement for a state energy plan and her commitment to scale up the state energy office, we feel confident that together we can implement the policies and practices needed to protect our state today and into the future. So what can you do to support the transition to an equitable, clean energy economy and encourage action on climate? Well, first of all, sign the Kansas Climate and Health Declaration at resilientkansas.org. Inspired by public health calls for action on climate change as a public health issue and informed by the Kansas Health Institute's Climate Change in Kansas report, CEP, along with many organizational supporters, came together last fall to release this declaration. The Kansas Climate and Health Declaration increases awareness of the impacts of climate change on public health, increases civic engagement on climate action, and advances policies that build resilience in Kansas. You can read and sign the declaration online at resilientkansas.org. Lastly, you can help solve climate by becoming an ambassador for Climate and Energy Voters Take Action. You'll be encouraged and provided with tools to help you register to vote, consider climate and health issues when voting, engage with elected officials on climate issues, encourage your family and friends to register and vote, and hold your elected officials accountable for their actions related to climate and health. I look forward to the rest of our conversation today, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dorothy. When you stop, I'll start and we'll continue this dance. Share screen. This is an opportunity now to talk with Dorothy, and here's my suggestion. I think that the easiest way to start is to use your chat boxes. So I will open my chat screen. Dorothy, you can follow it as well, but we'll only have time for 1 to 2 questions. So please type your question in the chat box, and Dorothy is now visible. So she'll be answering those questions, and she and I will both monitor them. There's a lot of information, and just know that these PowerPoint slides and the whole program will be recorded. We have all of your emails, so we'll be able to get back to you after the event if you were unable to have your question answered. But let's go ahead, and if you're interested in a particular point that you want Dorothy to explore for you, please type it into the chat box. Okay, let's take Teresa's question. Can you speak to the waste produced from turbines solar energy production?
So I can talk a little bit about the waste produced from turbines. As you know, wind turbines are very large pieces of equipment. The bases are made of steel, the foundations are made of concrete, there's steel rebar involved. And so one of the things that we're seeing as wind turbines start to become finished with their useful life are new industries that are popping up to try to recycle, particularly the wind turbine blades. The other parts of the wind turbine can be repurposed, reused. There's a market for steel. But the wind turbine blades has been something that the industry has been working to figure out what they can do with it in order to recycle it. And so there is a company that has begun to break down the wind turbine blades and grind them up into pellets so that they can be reused for other information or for other products. It's a very new industry. Wind farms are designed to last for 20 to 25 to 30 years or more. They are designed so that as new technology comes on board, they can be repowered. They can put a new nacelle on the top of an old turbine so that it can generate more energy far into the future.
Okay, one more quick question. What do you think are the prospects for PACE in the next legislative session?
And so PACE is Property Assessed Clean Energy, and that is a financing tool that allows businesses, if it's commercial PACE, or residential customers, if it's residential PACE, to be able to finance energy efficiency or clean energy or water investments, retrofits, through their property tax instead of through a traditional bank loan. We were fortunate to have an informational hearing on PACE, commercial PACE, in the Rural Revitalization Committee this legislative session before everything got crazy. However, the information was very well received. There were good questions by the committee members. And I think it's possible that we could see that legislation advancing in 2021.
Thank you. I think we'll go on. Thanks a lot. And everybody realize that we will give you access to these PowerPoints after the event. So things went very fast. There's a lot of information, but it's not over. So I'm moving on to the next speaker. Zack Pastora is next in our lineup. He's with the Kansas Sierra Club, entering his 9th year, and he also serves as Vice President of the Kansas Natural Resource Council and Executive Committee of the Kansas Rural Center. I won't read the rest of that. You can read it on your own. What I'm going to do is stop sharing so Zack can start.
Everyone, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, can you see me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, hey, appreciate it. Everyone, I am Zack Pistora, broadcasting to you from Linwood, Kansas, outside of Lawrence, and kind of in the countryside. So hopefully the internet will hold strong for the presentation on my end today. I want to say it's pretty special right now, and when we're all thinking about our own health and that of our loved ones and society and the world, it's really good that we think about how that involves the health of the planet too. So I'm really excited to join this webinar. A little bit about me, as mentioned, I'm the proud lobbyist for the Kansas Sierra Club, been doing that for 9 years, as well as serve as the vice president for the Kansas Natural Resource Council. But I'm talking to you about carbon farming as a practical solution to help solve the climate by 2030 for Kansas. And I got to learn a lot about farming and sustainable agriculture from a group of Kansas called the Kansas Rural Center. And for those that don't know, the Kansas Rural Center has been around for quite a while, I think since 1979, and they've been working to advance a diversified food and farming system across Kansas, and in a way that's economically viable and socially just. So I just want to put in a plug for them. They help farmers and ranchers across the state enhance their natural resources, help protect the soil health, and think about local and regional food opportunities for growing food. So go ahead and check them out if you're interested in my presentation on carbon farming here. But again, I'm excited to talk with you today. This is a new innovative agricultural strategy, carbon farming. It can really help the climate And Kansas would be well poised to be a state to help lead the country in terms of a good role model for these conservation agricultural practices. So through my presentation, I got a few slides I'll share here in just a moment, that Kansas can really help be a leader in carbon farming. Now, for those of you that don't know or aren't familiar with how Kansas's impact on the climate via its carbon emissions, it's interesting that Kansas currently ranks 31st in its carbon emissions totally of all states. We've dropped our carbon levels 19% since 2005. So I thought that was pretty good news. But in terms of average carbon output per capita, we rank in above average for states with our size and emissions levels. So if we were a country, if Kansas were a country, we would be in the top 60 of all countries in terms of our carbon output. So I thought that was, if we were a country, I thought that was pretty interesting. Now, as vice versa of Kansas impacting the climate also, as you know, impacts Kansas in a pretty significant way. For those that maybe aren't from here or haven't noticed, in the sunflower state, we've had an increasingly dangerous and costly climate-related disasters over the last decade. You might remember the back-to-back wildfires. Kansas doesn't, we may have some fires that we set, prescribed fires, but we don't typically have a big amount of wildfires like you might see in California or Australia. We had some of our largest wildfires in the state a few years back in back-to-back years. As Larry mentioned, we've had extreme flooding, 100-year flooding events. We've had emergency level droughts, powerful storm events. Here in Linwood, Kansas last year, we experienced F4 tornado, which was pretty scary, so you can imagine. But high force winds, severe storms, unseasonal weather swings are going to be a thing to go forward if we don't do something about the climate. So you all probably know this, but I just want to reiterate, this impact on climate change is threatening our community safety, our infrastructure, and economic sectors. But perhaps the most affected industry of Kansas is agriculture. And so if you think about the growing of crops and livestock are quite susceptible to the harms and impacts and volatile temperature swings of climate, our roughly 21 million acres of farmland across Kansas and thousands of farmers and ranchers whose livelihoods, farms depend on healthy crops and healthy livestock, it's important we do something about that. And predictability kind of goes out the window, but that's everything in agriculture. If we change things too much with climate change. So, you know, they face continual struggles with frost and hail and failing crop destruction with all those climate change impacts. But there is something that agriculture can do for us. And that's where I'll start my slideshow here. Okay, there's my title slide, Carbon Farming. We got some cool little pictures of some plants. I've joked that plants are been reducing carbon for us before it was cool, you know, before it was necessary. So we might take a few lessons from nature in reducing our carbon output. Want to go to this? Yeah.
Zach,
Need to see your
I'm not
slide.
seeing your slide.
Share screen.
Oh, sorry about that.
Take your time.
Thank you for letting me know. How's this from beginning slide? That better?
Yeah.
And I will hide my video hidden?
We see you, but that's all right. You're just a poster stamp.
Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and stop the video. Just keep the eye on the prize here. According to the EPA, I'll go to this slide here. That was my introductory slide. There you go. You take it in. Okay, here's my slide I was interested in. The EPA estimates 2017 that agriculture is only 9%, but still, as you can see, a good slice of the pie there of our carbon emissions. But if you add in land use change, and forestry, that's another 11% of the carbon footprint. So worldwide, 24% of the global CO2 output is agriculture and forestry. So that said, you know, agriculture's got a big responsibility here, but I want to talk about the way that they can reduce more carbon than they're actually taking up. And this is a way due to the photosynthesis and the plant respiration that I was mentioning about plants absorbing CO2 before we started really giving it a lot of thought as far as a climate change strategy. Agriculture can, in the way that we manage our agricultural soils, can account for half of agriculture's emissions right now. So we can not only decrease the negative impact of agriculture, but change the sector to be a big net benefit to the carbon cycle totally. And the answer here is carbon farming, a name that's been given to strategies known as sustainable regenerative agriculture that aims to take carbon out of the air and put it back in the soil. So as you see, some of the slides are showing the different places here. You know, some of the carbon emissions coming from our industries and factories, energy sector, as Dorothy was talking about, the impact of plants taking some of that CO2 in, using the roots to store some of that organic carbon in the soil, and how animals can be a part of that too. But a report from the National Academy of Sciences in 2018 estimated that carbon farming and changing our agricultural processes can result in a 3 billion tons of per year of carbon being put in the ground. The Rodale Institute, a prominent sustainable agricultural think tank, said as much as 100% of the annual global carbon emissions could be taken care of with the carbon farming. Now, let me say that carbon farming generally refers to a broad set of agricultural practices that take the carbon from the air and put them in the soil, as I said. And so when plants photosynthesize, they remove the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it internally within their plant bodies, and then down through their roots into the soil. When they die, this carbon can either be released back into the atmosphere or can be incorporated back in the soil to be stored for long periods of time. Here's some of the ways when we talk about carbon farming, some of the individual practices that we can use. Leftover biomass like corn stubble in Kansas that you may be familiar with can be incorporated back in the soil as a mulch instead of cleared or burned. No-till agriculture, Kansas is the #1 state for no-till acres, not plowing through the fields. Should replace conventional tillage and plowing and keep biomass plants going on the soil so we don't have barren landscapes, and that can continually help the carbon cycle from going into the from getting the carbon in the air and going in the soil. Through the use of cover crops is one way to do that. We're just starting to see the use of cover crops in Kansas. What I expect more cover crops to be done as we go on. Changing water irrigation practices, interestingly enough, and pest management strategies can help improve soil health and thus enable a higher level of carbon sequestration. And then we can also utilize what is considered marginal farmland right now and put it into a forestry operation or a grassland prairie ecosystem. So instead of tilling it, instead of making it a bare landscape, we can utilize some of those grasses and trees to do some of our carbon work for us. Here's another part, just to remind you some of that, a graphic about the plant respiration and carbon sequestration. There's just another slide. General Mills, got this from General Mills, makes their cereals and all that, talking about a left with conventional agriculture and then maybe what we could do with a sustainable agricultural type. And I'll say that in addition to offsetting emissions, carbon farming practices have additional benefits beyond just the carbon game of helping degraded soils and boosting crop production, reducing pollution by minimizing erosion and soil runoff or nutrient runoff, soil runoff, but also purifying surface and ground water and increasing microbial activity in soil biodiversity. So these are all good things, and something we should be doing, implementing carbon farming practices. And to help do that, researchers at Colorado State University, in conjunction with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, have developed a guide called the COMET, C-O-M-E-T, to help farmers implement these carbon farming strategies and calculate their impact. There's some of these practices in conservation practices in the U.S. Farm Bill now with the Conservation Stewardship Program and Conservation Reserve Program. And on a state level, we recently had introduced legislation to allow for an income tax deduction for those who utilize carbon farming practices and the COMET tool. So more to come here in Kansas on carbon farming. I'll just conclude with saying that there is a strong nexus between climate and Kansas agriculture with positive and negative impacts. But with the adoption of carbon farming practices, both in Kansas and the country and around the world, the agriculture community can literally help us grow a better future for us all and help reduce the carbon. So I appreciate everybody listening. Be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, anybody want to type their questions in the chat screen? Zack, can you comment on carbon impacts of soybeans raised for biodiesel?
I'm not an expert on soybeans. I think we can still grow a lot of our traditional agricultural crops in well-suited climate areas like soybeans and corn, et cetera. There should be part of the crop rotation. I would say I'm not familiar with the actual carbon intake of soybeans, but if we use some of those carbon farming practices, where we maybe plant them in the ground over some cover crops, or use them as part of a crop rotation. Soybeans help do fixate the nitrogen in the soil, so they're good for soil health generally. If we can use more organic and sustainable agricultural methods instead of using anhydrous ammonia fertilizer for soybeans, chemical-based fertilizer, maybe we could use a compost or a natural organic fertilizer amendment. So that's my best answer to that question. Thanks for your question.
And one more, please explain how vital the regeneration of soil, there are questions piling in really fast. I'm gonna open this up again.
That could either be a really good thing or a really bad thing if I didn't clarify very much,
Okay, here we go. Please explain how vital the regeneration of soil is for a sustainable future, since erosion and dead dirt are critical problems. This is from Dale.
Yeah, thank you, Dale. I think you're on to something, and I encourage you to join in the breakout session on carbon farming. Help us enlighten us all. But I'd say absolutely, the soil is one of our most valuable resources, and the more we can keep that from running off our fields, kind of essentially down the drain in the river, not to be utilized for good farming, for food and fuels and all that for our society. So let's take a riparian forest or a grassland buffer strip. Okay. Essentially, if we have some plants between the farm and the water source, the river or the creek. That can stop the water erosion. It can slow things down. It can not only help with the carbon and grow plants so we can take the carbon out of the air, but it slows down those nutrients. Those nutrients get sucked up by the by the plants as well. So, soil loss is a critical problem across the world, and the more we can do that, do our part here in Kansas, help lead the country in doing that, would be better. So, thank you.
Thank you, Zach, for reminding us that people will still have an opportunity to ask questions during the breakout session. I'm going to go back and share my screen. And I'm afraid you guys are going to have to look at my administration side of this because I was a little bit clumsy, but I think you can see Zach there. And I'm going to back up because I've got Tami Alexander next, and she's going to give a talk. She joined the Metropolitan Energy Center in 2017 to support the ethanol and biodiesel projects in Kansas. In January 2018, she became the program coordinator of the Central Kansas Clean Cities Coalition, managing event coordination, outreach, customer relationship management, program administration, research writing, and project development. So I'm now going to let her take the screen, and then she'll give some time for questions and answers at the end. Okay.
Okay, can everyone see my screen there and hear me speaking?
You could speak a little louder. Please adjust your volume on your microphone.
Okay, how's that? Any better?
That's better if you could increase it just a little bit more. We've got people phoning in and they might have some difficulty.
Okay.
That's good.
All right. So, as she said, I'm Tami Alexander. I'm from Metropolitan Energy Center. Just a little bit about Metropolitan Energy Center and who we are. We were a nonprofit started in 1983 and worked originally in energy efficiency in the built environment, focusing on older homes and retrofitting them to make them more energy efficient. We currently now do work still in that sector with small commercial buildings and multi-unit dwellings. In 1998, we branched out into transportation, with the goal of reducing petroleum use in transportation through the Clean Cities program. They started the Kansas City Regional Clean Cities Coalition in 1998. And then in 2013, we started the Central Kansas Clean Cities Coalition, which is based in Wichita and covers the rest of Kansas outside of the Kansas City area. A little bit about the Clean Cities program. It's actually a program of the Department of Energy's Vehicles Technologies Office that was started out of the Energy Policy Act in 1992. Around the country, there are about 80 designated coalitions nationwide, and they kind of work so that there's a framework from government policies, government agencies, and local businesses so they can work together to find local answers to transportation problems and to help work to reduce the petroleum use in transportation. Since 1993, the Clean Cities program nationwide have offset nearly 10 billion gallons of petroleum, and they do that through a variety of ways. We support domestic alternative fuels, biodiesel, electricity, ethanol, hydrogen, natural gas, and propane. We also work to improve vehicle efficiency with improved technologies and transportation strategies. And a lot of our work goes to reduce harmful emissions through other options such as idle reduction, trip elimination, and then of course, as I said, switching to cleaner alternative fuels. So in 2017, transportation surpassed electricity generation as the #1 producer of emissions in the US. So definitely we know that transportation is a significant part of emissions, and we need to improve the sustainability of transportation. So how can we do that? Everybody's heard the term reduce, reuse, recycle. For transportation, it's a little bit different. It's reduce, recycle, as in used cooking oil for fuel, and then replace. So some of the options that we can do. The basic one, and I think recent events have showed us how we can work through that, is to avoid transportation. Obviously, the easiest way to reduce emissions and energy use for transportation is to limit those unnecessary trips. So there's two categories when you think about trip elimination. It's movement of people and movement of freight. If you're talking about the movement of people, we need to work so that there are policies in place so that businesses, educational institutions, government organizations are supportive of and encourage policies that don't require a physical presence. There's lots of ways this can be done. We need to have businesses and agencies available of answering questions and offering solutions via email, telephone calls, chat. That's currently available for a lot of things, but it's not always an option for financial and legal issues that require in-person interactions. And so we need to have some policy changes to make that happen. We need businesses to be supportive and educational institutions to be supportive of telework options and online meetings and classes. They don't have to happen every day, but maybe you could have a business that allows telecommuting a few days a week. Maybe some classes, maybe your lecture classes are offered online, but the lab classes you come into the hall, just to help reduce some of those trips. Electronic banking, that's a great thing. The financial institution, unfortunately, still requires a lot of things be done in person. And so if they can make some changes to that, and it is improving, it's much better, but if we can make some changes to that, that's going to help. And then telemedicine. A lot of that has been changed with the recent epidemic, but we need to have updated regulations that allow for simple appointments to be done via telemedicine, and so that they can do telemedicine across state lines. That's currently a regulation that's holding us back in increasing that. Now, if we talk about movement of freight, paper, mail, there's lots of things that can be done with that. And those businesses and government agencies, they need to catch up with technology and institute policies and legislation that allow the replacing of movement of paper and physical goods with digital options. Electronic billing, online statements, and legal notifications. A lot of this happens already. I still get paper in the mail though for real estate tax notifications and vehicle registration notices. Banking notification requirements often require that an actual paper form is mailed out. They also need to look at eliminating additional charges for using some of these electronic forms, such as electronic payments, to help encourage people to limit the movement of actual paper and goods. Also, it would be great if we could do online completion of forms, signing forms online, especially when you're dealing with financial and legal documents. We've been able to file our taxes online for years. So, why do you have to go to the store and fill out forms for other types of things, or go to the government office to fill out forms for other types of things that have less stringent requirements for personal security? E-textbooks and digital media, those are great options. So we don't have truckloads of textbooks and mail being shipped. And any of the movement of paper and mail that could be easily transmitted electronically is a great thing to replace, to limit the amount of freight, because all of that freight adds to emissions from transportation. So if you do have to go somewhere or move goods, try to stay local if you can. Bike or walk whenever you can. And in order to make that possible, we have to have state and local funding to support the amenities that make cities pedestrian and bike friendly. Sidewalks and bike paths, those are important. How many of these newer communities are lacking sidewalks and thereby promoting vehicle traffic? Bike racks outside of businesses, a really simple thing that could be added. Many of these businesses have huge parking lots, but think about it, how many of them have bike racks? We also need to have support, and if it's necessary, funding for localized amenities in neighborhoods, and especially in rural communities. Schools and houses of worship, to limit the busing of students, grocery stores, pharmacy, retail. We've all seen that these are considered essential businesses in the last several days. These options need to be made available in all communities and neighborhoods, especially when we're talking about rural communities. So they aren't being forced to drive to another community to receive these essential services. Restaurants, parks, entertainment, it's great to have those local so that people don't have to leave their communities in order to access them. And then of course, hospitals and medical facilities. Those are important, especially when we're talking about rural communities, to kind of reduce that amount of travel. Thirdly, we need to try and work to limit urban sprawl, infill in urban communities, rejuvenate downtowns, so that we're not just keep building out. Try to keep things localized. And then lastly, when we're talking about goods and services, we need to support local foods and local manufacturers, making the regulations for things like farmers markets and artisan fairs to be workable so that people don't have to ship their stuff off, halfway across the country in order to sell their goods. When motorized transportation is needed, it's important to use mass transit and ride sharing. And when I'm talking about ride sharing, I'm not talking about Uber and Lyft. That's not the ride sharing I'm referring to. I'm talking about carpooling and van pooling and things like that. Community and state support for mass transit and business support for carpooling is essential to make this happen. We need reliable, affordable, and widely available transit options within communities. And these options need to be realistically feasible for travel to work, for shopping, for entertainment. I can get somewhere in town, maybe it takes an hour and a half on the bus. I can be there in 10 minutes in a vehicle. And so that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about realistic options. So we need something that makes it feasible that people will want to take mass transit when they can. We need support for public transportation options, such as buses and passenger rail between communities and then extending into their surrounding states. We also need communities support and business support for incentives for carpooling, van pooling, things like that, office-wide carpool lists, business funding for employee transit passes or van pool costs. So these are all important things that we can do to limit the amount of transportation that's needed, and that helps to reduce emissions. Currently, with the stay-at-home orders, large cities are having some of the best air quality that they've had in decades. And a lot of that is due to the fact there are less vehicles on the road. So we know that making these changes to transportation can have an immediate effect on our air quality and emissions. Now, one of the most important things that's needed, because some transportation is required and that's not going to change, but Kansas needs to have state and local incentives for alternative fuels and alternative fuel vehicles. There's many options out there: electric vehicles, ethanol, which is a biofuel, biodiesel and renewable diesel, also a biofuel, natural gas, renewable natural gas, propane and renewable propane. All of these options need to be supported, because what works in one community or in one type of duty cycle doesn't necessarily work for all options. And we want the individual users of this transportation and of these fuels to be able to choose what works for them, rather than the state deciding what works, what's the best option. So electric vehicles, this is frequently the common thing that's put out there of the way to solve climate is we need to move to electric vehicles. Electric vehicles are great, especially here in Kansas. They have really low emissions because we have a lot of carbon-free power from nuclear and a really high penetration of wind power. So that makes these very low emission vehicles. The infrastructure is expanding. There's more options becoming available. We still need more expansion of the infrastructure and more options for vehicles, but it is getting better. Electric vehicles are an excellent option if you're talking about a commuter vehicle. They work great for transit buses that are coming back to the Bay, and they can charge overnight and be used the next day. And other types of return to base city activities such as box trucks and things like that. There are issues though with electric vehicles in that it's not being adopted quickly enough. Currently, plug-in vehicles are only about 2% of the vehicle market, and we need some immediate solutions to solve climate issues because electric vehicle adoption just isn't happening quickly enough. One of the best options that's available right now is biofuels. They're currently available, they're renewable, they're low emission, and they're a very affordable substitute for petroleum fuels. They work with the current infrastructure and the vehicles that are out there. It provides economic benefits for Kansas in providing a market for agricultural products and jobs at biofuel production facilities across the state. There's little to no increased cost for fleets. They can typically use the same infrastructure that they already have in place for their petroleum fuels. Often there's decreased fuel costs too, to use a biofuel in exchange for a petroleum fuel. It's important too that we look at biofuels as an option for environmental equity and social justice issues. Not everyone can go out there and buy a new electric vehicle, but you can just change your fuel and that makes your car instantly greener. You don't even have to change your vehicle, change your fuel and your car is greener. Ethanol is a great option that we can use. It's an alcohol-based fuel that can be used in gasoline vehicles. Any vehicle can run a 10% ethanol blend. Matter of fact, most of the fuel that's out there contains 10% ethanol because ethanol is an excellent option for octane. It increases the octane in the fuels, and that's needed in these modern, more efficient engines. If you have a vehicle that's 2001 or newer, you can use a 15% ethanol blend, also known as E15, which is an excellent option, even greener, even cleaner. And then if you have a flex fuel vehicle, you can use what's called E85, which is an 85% ethanol blend. Biodiesel and renewable diesel is another excellent option. Those are replacements that can be used in diesel vehicles. It's renewable fuel made from vegetable oils and animal fats. Primarily here in the US, it's made from soybean oil and recycled cooking oil. It can be used in diesel engines, and it's an excellent option and an immediate fuel replacement for heavy-duty freight. Natural gas and renewable natural gas, much cleaner burning option than petroleum diesel. They have lower emissions than petroleum diesel. And often with the newest engines, they're near, newest natural gas engines, they're near zero emissions. If you're using renewable natural gas, which is methane that can come from wastewater treatment plants, landfills, etc., those can have a negative carbon footprint because you're capturing that methane that would have naturally been released into the environment, and instead you're using it in a vehicle. And so that's limiting it getting into the atmosphere. Natural gas is widely available through pipelines that are running across most of the state. The fuel costs for natural gas are lower and they're a lot more stable than diesel. And it's an excellent option for heavy duty vehicles such as freight trucks, buses, and refuse trucks. Propane and renewable propane, sorry. It's a cleaner burning fuel with a lot lower emissions than petroleum diesel. It's also widely available. I mean, this is the same fuel that's used to heat and cool heat buildings. It's used in your barbecue. So propane is widely available. It's a low initial investment compared to some of the other alternative fuels, and it's much lower fuel costs than diesel. It's an excellent option for school buses because it burns a lot cleaner and it's a lot quieter operation than diesel. And it's not a huge cost to institute a fueling station for propane because it's basically just a giant propane tank, similar to your barbecue tank, but it's huge. And they can use it to fill their school buses. And so it's a low investment for these school districts to switch to. So basically, Kansas needs some policies to do some of the following. And by policies, I'm not just talking about legislation and funding. This is also going to include changes to business practices. But we need to reduce transportation for the people and the movement of goods. We need to encourage bike walk communities, localized food and goods. We need to improve public transportation and ride pooling within communities and connect communities statewide. The state needs to recognize and support all alternative fuels. As I said, what works in downtown Kansas City isn't maybe going to work in liberal Kansas. So there's different options and we need to choose. We don't want the state to choose. We need the individual users to be able to choose which alternative fuels work for their case. We think which should be required that alternative fuels are used by government fleets. It'd be great if we saw a mandate of a minimum biofuel content for liquid fuels, similar to what they've done in Minnesota. It'd be important to incentivize and support the development of alternative fuel infrastructure and to incentivize the purchase of alternative fuel vehicles. So a lot of times moving into these alternative fuels, electric vehicles, natural gas, there's additional costs over purchasing a gasoline vehicle or gasoline fueling equipment. So it's important that we subsidize this and incentivize it in some way so that companies, businesses, agencies are able to move to it. And that's it. And with that, I can take your questions.
Thank you. I'll take one question. There's been some comments and information sharing about air quality during this COVID-19 emergency. People asking about where you would go for a source of information on monitoring the air quality due to the drop in transportation. Do you have any suggestions, or do you want to wait until we have the breakout session for that?
I know that NASA does a lot of air quality monitoring, which is really interesting, and it's publicly available. You can go to the NASA website, and they're able to do it somehow from satellites. I really don't understand the science behind how it works, but they have some information on that, which is how they've been able to quickly know that the shutdown due to the virus has really improved the air quality around the country. So, and that's not all transportation. I don't want to say that's all transportation because some industry has shut down as well. But transportation has been a huge, has seen a huge decrease because people just aren't going everywhere. They're staying at home. And so that's also contributed to the improved air quality.
Okay, thank you very much. We've got about, we have two more presenters, and then we're going to get into a breakout session. So I'm going to move right ahead and introduce Rabbi Moti Reber. He's with the Kansas Interfaith Action. He served as executive director of the Kansas Interfaith Action and its predecessor organization, the Kansas Interfaith Power and Light, since March 2011. He's a native of New Jersey, and he's lived in Kansas since 2007. He's a graduate of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in Wyncote, Pennsylvania, and is a lifelong activist on peace, social justice, and environmental issues. Rabbi Reber, I would like you to just share your screen, and we'll go ahead with your slides.
Okay, thank you. Where am I going here? Where's my, there we are. Do you see my presentation?
Not yet.
Okay.
Go to share screen and then find the PowerPoint on your desktop. And if you're like me, it might be in play mode and it might be in open mode.
It's not there. Where is it? Show all windows. Ah, there we are. Okay. Now
There we go.
Okay. Great. All right, everybody. Thank you for having me. Thank you for doing this. So I'm here to talk about resilience. So I'm from Kansas Interfaith Action, which I will mention is a statewide faith-based issue advocacy organization. We work on a variety of issues, including climate and energy. We've been in this space for several years, I guess, 8 years, something like that. As long as Zach's been doing it, I've been doing it. So that's how I judge. All right. So this is something that, this is kind of a 101 statement, but there's two aspects of addressing climate change. The first is mitigation, which is lowering emissions, which is what everybody talks about and as everybody is talking about tonight. And the second one is adaptation or resilience, which is dealing with the changes that are already in the pipeline. So even if we were to stop emitting climate pollutants today, we still already have we already have higher temperatures, and we will continue to have higher temperatures from climate emissions and warming that's already in the pipeline. So I think 10 years ago, people were saying that you shouldn't talk about adaptation because they felt like it ceded the argument about mitigation. That is, if you started to talk about resilience, then you were saying that we shouldn't do the things that it would take to lower carbon emissions. I don't think we see that anymore, partially because it's 10 years later, and partially because they're two sides of the coin. But we need to deal with both. If you see on the right, this is from the Union of Concerned Scientists, and they're talking about a resilience gap, and adaptation and mitigation both together will lower that resilience gap. And the longer we wait, the bigger the gap is and the harder it is to fill. So just to predict the outcome of this presentation, my argument is that Kansas needs to incorporate adaptation to climate changes that are already happening in all of its planning. And of course, Kansas is nowhere on planning for adaptation as it is nowhere on climate policy generally, which is a big problem. So there's resilience. National Academy of Sciences defines resilience as the ability to prepare for, absorb, recover from, and more successfully adapt to adverse events. There are two kinds of levels of adverse events related to climate. One is chronic events, such as hotter weather and water availability, and some of them are acute shocks, such as wildfires. So understanding how Kansas is vulnerable to each aspect of climate disruption is key to planning for the future. And as with all kind of government services, money that you spend at the front end saves money at the back end. So money spent on planning and adaptation, preparing in advance, saves the costs in terms of disaster relief, and fixing problems that occur at the back end. And we are already seeing, I didn't really include much of this in the talk, but we are already seeing increased spending on disaster recovery, floods recovery, and wildfires in particular. Everything we spend on building resilience at the beginning is an investment in the long-term sustainability, the health and well-being of Kansans as we go forward into a time of climate uncertainty. So I'm just picking 3 areas. These are kind of random, but there's other areas, but I'm just going to give you some. This is not a comprehensive presentation. This is kind of giving you an overview of some of the thinking that could be involved in this kind of work. So heat, wildfire, and drought. So heat, extreme heat causes more deaths than any other weather-related hazard. By 2050, the number of dangerous heat days in Kansas is predicted to double. People who are particularly vulnerable include older adults, infants with children, people with disabilities, people with chronic conditions, low-income residents, outdoor workers. Actually, a lot of it overlaps with the people who are most susceptible to COVID. Extreme heat causes economic losses, causes people to be unable to work. Higher temperatures also put additional stress on electric grids, resulting in power outages. And of course, that's another place where there's a imbalance, an equity imbalance, because not everybody can afford air conditioners or to keep their or their energy bills when they have to keep their air conditioners running twice as much during the course of the summer. Energy costs will increase, which is a burden to low income. Now, so resilience? Then these are based on resilience strategies. There's some footnotes at the bottom. I can share with you my bibliography if you want it. These are all studies that have been done over the course of the last few years. In the urban areas, cool roofs reduce heat sensitivity. So painting the roof white instead of having it be black actually makes a big difference. It reduces energy use and the heat, the illness inside the building. Many cities and counties and states around the country have either mandatory or incentivized or city-led cool roof initiatives. So the sheer variety of the number of governments that have these policies show to its broad effectiveness and support. Also in urban areas or suburban areas, increasing tree cover and green spaces lowers the heat island effect. Raising awareness. Now, in all of these areas, all the 3 areas I'm going to talk about, raising awareness and effective messaging is really an important part of government response. How do you communicate to population about heat events, where they can go, how to be safe, what services are available, what media channels can you use, how are you going to reach out to populations that don't speak English as a first language, how having cooling centers in public buildings. All of these things are necessary. It's not just necessary to have them, but it's necessary to communicate that to the public. So developing those communication strategies and those databases, or that record of places to go, whatever services that are available, are vitally important, and that's going to come up in each of these areas. Wildfires. Now, we've had wildfires across the Southern Plains in the last two of the last 4 years, including in Kansas, of course. Climate change increases temperatures, drier conditions, and insect outbreaks, all of which increase the risk of wildfires. Wildfire is both a cause and an effect of climate disruption because it degrades air quality, it degrades habitat, and it has its own health impacts. So it's a feedback loop situation. We always used to talk about ice caps as being a feedback loop because they're both a cause and an effect of climate change, but wildfires is a more local example. The state has not conducted a wildfire vulnerability assessment, even though we have had wildfires over the last few years. And of course, there's no plan for addressing wildfire risks specific to climate change. And wildfires across the Southern Plains in recent years resulted in significant environmental and economic losses, with the ag sector actually really strongly affected. Resilience, zoning and landscape management. Tami talked about urban sprawl, and that's an issue here as well. Fire-resistant construction and retrofits. Water availability has a huge impact on the resilience to wildfires. And again, increasing communication. There was a study done, a conference about dealing with wildfires in the Southern Plains, and there's a record of that conference, which I didn't footnote here, but I have it available. And they had a list, and this one, increasing communication collaboration amongst local, state, and federal levels, was in their list. They had use of controlled burns, but they also had this coordination amongst government levels. And again, public education and preparedness. Now, this has specific benefits not only on the climate issue, but you save insurance if you save on insurance, property values stabilize, and increases public trust. And then water availability is my third point. The drought threat is actually related directly to climate change, is projected to increase in Kansas less than in other states, but we do have a big problem with availability of water in the ag sector due to the overuse of the aquifer. So that is going to emphasize, or that's going to double down on the issue for us. States at risk is another one of the studies. They predict in Kansas that crop yields will decrease approximately 2 to 12% at the state level due to drought, as drought needs outstrip irrigation capacity. Ways to address drought and water availability. I think some of the stuff Zack talked about really fits very well in this. Healthy soil, minimizing turf grass, which is like, that's a big deal. I live in Overland Park and it's turf grass central, but it's a very water intensive and unsustainable decorating tool. Using native plants, capturing runoff, pricing water effectively, using conservation ordinances. Now, some of this is already done because we do have intermittent periods of drought. I think there's been 2 sort of significant droughts over the last 10 years. So some of these tools have been used. Requiring water efficient irrigation devices. So central post is not great. And don't frack, because fracking, use of water in fracking for natural gas can damage wastewater, can damage the water supply, and also it kind of wastes water because you have to inject the water permanently. It takes it out of the water supply. So it's not a good it's not a good tool. There's a number of problems with fracking, but the water aspect of it is an important one for this particular context. And of course, public education and outreach, focusing on the necessity and benefits of conserving water. This is an ongoing issue, an ongoing priority. The importance of state level planning. So states have to plan because states are, they can promote collaboration across regions and between the public and the private sector. They have a lot of ability to put resilience practices into state-owned assets and operations. Also, they have governing responsibility over certain sectors of the economy, including insurance, transportation, and building codes. So having the state decide that all the state buildings are going to be, LEED certified or whatever up to LEED standards, that's an efficiency issue. It's not not necessarily in this topic, but that would have a huge stimulus impact on the sector. And all planning and resource allocation decisions across the state sector should be made with an eye towards the way they impact climate, and they do or don't address resilience in our state or our communities. So anything that we plan, including road construction, everything should have climate planning in its in the thought process. Now, Colorado has done quite a bit of this. Following floods, they've established a recovery office to spearhead the development of a Colorado resistance framework. This is really worth looking up if you care to Google it. Establishes the state's commitment to resiliency and sets long-term goals. Identifies priority projects and initiates the process of building resiliency into day-to-day state activities. They have an office that's devoted to this, and it's in legislation that their planning is supposed to take climate impacts into account. And they've also developed a climate action plan, which is what we're hoping to accomplish here as well. Climate adaptation, resilience building must prioritize equitable outcomes. Climate risks are faced the most by the most vulnerable groups. Climate change affects the sick, poor, and the poor first and worst. And we have a moral obligation to protect the health, safety, and well-being of those who are most vulnerable and least empowered. And engaging communities in the decision-making process so that we decide with and not for, this could really end up badly where people who are poor or sick end up taking the short end of the stick as we make development decisions that prioritize the well-being of more affluent people. So engaging people at the beginning in the development of resilience policies and climate policies is very important in order to make sure that the most vulnerable are protected as much as possible in a changing climate. Building resilience is something Dorothy touched on. I'm coming to the end, I promise. Building resilience to climate disruption means making sure that our residents have access to what they need to survive and thrive, even if the systems we've been relying on experience intermittence. And this means energy, water, and food. Dorothy talked about a bottom-up energy policy. I think the same thing applies with food. We don't grow very many of the fruits and vegetables that we eat in Kansas. I think 90% of our fruits and vegetables are grown elsewhere, and it would take a very small percentage of our of the land that's based on agriculture in order to be sustainable on fruits and vegetables. So that's something we should definitely be thinking about. And any system that is fully centralized, including the food system or the energy system, is vulnerable to breakdowns in supply lines. And we always have to assume Murphy's Law is still in effect. Building an economy, so this is kind of more visionary part, building an economy based on the provision of what people need and less on the production of commodities will support the livelihoods of our neighbors and our resilience to climate change. So starting to base our economy on the provision of services and care work, the things that we're seeing now are the most important, are much more sustainable and important than commodities and a consumer-based economy. As we rebuild in the aftermath of COVID, we will need to focus our efforts on human need and towards a just and sustainable stimulus and supporting resiliency and sustainability in our economy. And then that is our contact information. If you are not familiar with KIFA, I encourage you to look us up, send me your email address, happy to put you on the list. And especially if you belong to a faith community or consider yourself a person of faith or conscience, please let us know, because we'd love to engage you in our work. And thus is the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Reber. This is Donna, the moderator, and in interest of time, I think we're going to save the questions for this session and for capture in our email. My clock shows that we have 30 minutes left, and we don't want to miss a presentation by Whitney Wilson. She'll be up next, and I'm going to give her a brief verbal introduction while she sets up her slides. Whitney Wilson of Climate Action KC. She's also a Water One board member for Johnson County, Kansas, and on the Engagement Committee co-chair for Climate Action KC. She's a senior population health executive for Cerner Corporation, where she's focused on public and community health initiatives across the healthcare system. So please take it away, Whitney.
Great. Can you all see my screen? Hear me okay?
Hearing is good, seeing is good.
Okay. All right. So thank you for that introduction. About 2 years ago, I was sitting around the dinner table with a couple of friends who just happened to be some climate scientists, and we were talking about what solutions were out there to combat climate change. And at the time, they told me that we were really behind the curve to meet Paris Accord guidelines, and that we had limited time to take action and reverse the effects that humans have caused to the planet. And this made me realize that I needed to reach out to decision makers and find out what we might be doing on a local level to solve the problem. So I met with my city council person, my state rep, my state senator, and it's there that I discovered that they were all part of a group called Climate Action KC. And this was actually founded by Mayor Michael Kelly and Councilwoman Lindsay Constance. And so I asked Mike and Lindsay to coffee one day, and it's then that I learned that they were working really quickly to roll out a strategy that would help to combat the effects of climate change right here in our metro area. They too felt that there was a lot of urgency to act after reading things like NOAA's reports on record-breaking temperatures and increases across the globe that were just untenable, and the fact that Kansas City is ranked 5th on the Climate Disruption Index for increased drought, increased flooding, urban heat islands, all of these expected to come our way, and we've seen in the past couple of years. And they knew that they needed to take action, and that it needed to be a regional effort if they were going to make a difference. So today, Climate Action KC has grown to around 100 state and local officials on both sides of the state line, all of whom are working in concert to adopt and roll out climate resilient solutions in our area. I think some of the things that are interesting about this is they're gaining recognition from places like National League of Cities. They won the Community Resilience Award. They won the Changemakers Award and Making Democracy Work Award, and they were semifinalists for America's Climate Action, Eco America's Climate Action Group. But I think most importantly, out of this list possibly is that the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy and the International Urban Cooperation from the European Union offered a special program. It's actually a specific guidance on greenhouse gas emissions inventory, climate risk, and vulnerability assessment. There were 4 cities in the United States that were offered this special guidance. And we're going to be rolling that out this year, and can't wait to be able to share that with you all and with your colleagues. But this is going to be able to show more in-depth information where local leadership can just really hone in on the areas that are going to make the biggest difference, and where they can focus their efforts to draw down climate change. And so, I'd like to extend just a special thanks to our partners across the community, to CEP and to all of those, at the community and commercial levels who have really helped to shape and strengthen the strategy. and all the tactical details that go along with this climate action plan that we're going to be delivering this year. And we have a climate action playbook that we've already brought to the public. It's modeled after Paul Hawkins' book Drawdown, and it offers all kinds of proven solutions that city officials and community members can adopt today to create a more resilient environment. And there are things that, you know, can be led in a variety of different ways from local leadership and from community members alike. So I'd encourage you to go onto the Climate Action KC website, download the playbook for yourself if you have not yet done so, and take a peruse through that to see if there is some of the elements that are near and dear to your heart, or that you know have been proven that you have not yet adopted to get going with projects this year. For example, I'd just like to call out from the top right there, Prairie Village. They have already adopted LEED Platinum building status for the new public works building. It includes things like solar panels, state-of-the-art HVAC. They're piloting neighborhood compost programming with Compost Collective KC. And I think that they have been a role model for some of their neighbors to get things going. Roland Park has passed solar ready ordinance already, so that the neighborhood can get involved with solar panels should they have the design to do so. And then they're also partnering with Evergy for a new solar array at the City Hall Pool and Community Center. And they, I believe, passed investment of the Dynamex climate inventory software, where they can get really specific around ways to impact the environment in their particular community. Shawnee is working with the local organization Bike Walk KC to review its complete street strategy. So they're excited and working quickly through that process. Independence, Missouri. Wow, so in 2018, they had adopted a resolution to become the greenest city in America. So in some ways, I think we're all looking to Independence, Missouri for ways that we can keep up with their benchmarks. I am on the Water One board, and of course, I'm proud to share that last year in 2019, we won the Sustainability Award for just practices that make sense for running a water utility. And then this year, we're looking at ways that we can continue to increase resilient efforts, reduce our footprint. We're looking at leasing more solar energy. We're taking a review at our fleet to see if there's any way we can be more sustainable there. All kinds of different ways that we're looking at. We'll do investments in changing over the infrastructure so that there's less water loss along the delivery system, things of this nature. And then City of Mission is conducting an energy efficient audit as a result of the playbook. And they're looking at the community center specifically to define what they can do with efficiency upgrades. And then also they have a sustainability commission. They launched a battery recycling program that's diverted over 2 tons of waste from landfills just from the City of Mission. And that includes hazardous lithium-ion batteries. So, and then I know Overland Park, Kansas was just recently highlighted in the news for working through switching out traditional street lights to LED street lights. And they're just looking at the playbook to define what else they can really tackle in the next 12, 24, and 36 months. And then finally, Lenexa has this great watershed strategy working closely with the county. And they're looking at, they've got a municipal greenhouse, and they're literally using the native plants that they're growing in that greenhouse to line their streets and areas where there's runoff and things of this nature. So really excited about the progress that they're making there. I'm happy to take questions on that, but these are some of the folks that we've been working with. Love to hear more stories that are out there from an engagement perspective. I'm working with expansion processes, you'll notice that a lot of this is Kansas-based. We need more Missouri highlights on this, and so welcome to reach out to me if you know of things that are going on. There are some items that you definitely don't want to miss. I know that air quality came up earlier in presentations. So Mark, on April 17th, is going to be sharing a Air Quality 101 presentation. And they're going to be talking about things like how they can proactively improve the air quality, just sharing a little bit about what ozone is, how it impacts our health, what the economic costs are. It's something that they have been monitoring for a number of years, I know, and they're just, you know, continuing to work together to look at ways that they can help to reduce pollution in our area. And then also we have Earth Day. That's coming up on the 22nd, and we're going to have some great virtual events. If you go to the Metro KC Climate Action website and you're looking at the list of elected officials, check to see if your elected leaders are on that list yet. And if they aren't, you can download the pledge and have them take a look at it and see if that's something they might be interested in participating in this year. And then finally, the Climate Action Plan, the date for the next Climate Action workshop will be released soon. It's during that time that you'll be able to see the vulnerability assessment, the greenhouse emissions inventory, and we want community input on all of that. So I encourage you to keep an eye out on social media. That date should be released soon, and would love your participation in all three of these events, and just welcome you forward to your colleagues as well. And then finally, I guess last but not least, you know, you're always welcome to check in with us, get your leaders connected. If you want my help in reaching out to folks, I am happy to make a connection there. Just let me know in the chat box, and I'll take questions.
Okay, thank you very much. We now have about 17 minutes left, and if you'll stop sharing your screen and I'll go on to ours, there's two more components to this. And one is basically a breakout session. Jerry is going to divide us into groups, and we have 15 minutes to basically share. And I encourage you all to use chat as long as you can to input your ideas here on what you want to see go into a Kansas climate and energy plan. Now we have these 4 different groups. Jerry, do you want to talk about how we will break out and then return?
Well, right now, since we have quite a few people online, we're going to have to, I'm sorry, apologize, but we will randomly put you into a group. Each group will have a moderator, and you can see the moderators for energy storage. You know, we have Dorothy and Whitney. Transportation is Tami and Donna. Carbon farming will be Zack and Danita, and resiliency is Moti and Larry. So I'm going to attempt to get these people assigned. So, and how much time are we giving Donna for this?
Well, we have 15 minutes left in our original schedule, and I think that's probably the best that we can do. We committed to 2 hours, but what I would suggest is that people, no matter what group you end up in, do deploy that chat box and answer questions so that we can get the most throughput that we possibly can.
And I'll say this is the fun part of it, where we get to interact with your moderator. So you do have a chance, if you want to even turn on your microphone and make this a very interactive event. So I'm gonna have to just give me a few minutes to move people around here a little bit, because I need to make sure we get the right moderators in the right rooms.
And moderators, go ahead and start video for yourselves.
Okay, so I'm opening the rooms right now, and then I'm going to be moving some people around. So moderators, don't be surprised if you end up in the wrong room initially, okay?
And in this transition, go ahead and use chat if you want to record your comments or your questions. For those of you who are still on and have survived the trip away and back, congratulations. And thank you, Jerry, for that. I'm going to share my screen, and the final wrap up for this session is basically to ask people what they are willing to do. And here's where we can answer by chat in lieu of a poll. We'd really like to know from you how you see yourself participating in the development of a Kansas climate and energy plan. And these were just a few suggestions, but we'd be happy for free form answers as well. Are you willing to actually read and give feedback to drafts of the plan? Would you like your email to be down as somebody who's in the review process? There will obviously be the need for a lot of stakeholder groups involved in the examination and development of this plan as it evolves. And we need, of course, advocates who are going to be reminding their elected officials of upcoming learning opportunities and votes on this. We really want to know also the kinds of information that you would prefer. And we've already seen a good deal of exchange within the chat of this. So we had a highly informed group of people who signed up today, but everybody has their own niche. And so if you want to get information, in what way do you prefer to get it? And what's your favorite mode of interaction in this regard? I think we can actually, we're down to 40 people. I'd be willing to read chat and see who wants to talk. Any hands waving or chat?
This is Dorothy. I just want to say we've had a really great conversation in our breakout room, good thoughts about next steps. And I just really appreciate K-State, Larry, and the other planners for working hard to put this together. Looking forward to where we head next with this.
Anyone else want to volunteer what their observations were in their breakout rooms, or some conclusions that you're coming to on terms of involvement and next steps?
Can we get some other discussions from some of the breakout rooms?
This is Tami, and in transportation, there was a lot of support for statewide transportation between communities and reaching outside the state. Then we also had the need to, in order to reduce transportation uses at all, to increase rural bandwidth in rural areas, so that people in rural areas have the options to do telecommuting and all of those things online that we're able to when we live in the larger cities.
How about the carbon farming? What did we hear in that group?
Yeah, that was a very lively breakout session. We had a few questions on, do we have any plans right now to move anything forward in carbon farming? And, other than some of the group activity at the nonprofit level, maybe some stuff at the university. We don't have a necessarily a state policy on that yet. But Emily mentioned that it would be good if we saw farmers to be the lead voice here, to activate their own communities, share positive examples of carbon farming that's worked for them, and maybe we see if we can uplift those for others to follow suit. So good discussion. We did say that maybe K-State Extension would be a good network that we could work with going forward to try to get some of these conversations happen at the kind of local level between farmers. So, yep, I'd say that was just a few of the, oh, and last but not least, I should say the top comment to start our break room was that we need more urgency and action involving all this. So that was very well noted. So.
Moti, Reber? Or Larry? What were you gathering from the resiliency discussions? And if you prefer to use chat, go right ahead.
I don't see Moti on there anymore.
Well, I was in that room. This is Whitney Wilson. One of the things I thought was interesting is that in the discussion, they were talking about how Department of Defense is actually mandating civil agencies to establish microgrids in anticipation of electrical outages this summer. And in fact, that the supply chain is something at like 40% operation status, either because of sickness or taking care of loved ones, or other things going on with the supply chain there. So we were just talking about, how do we look at that from a local level, and help our leadership to find ways to adapt to that situation. But I thought that was interesting. I had not heard about that yet.
I think we'll give it about 3 more minutes for people to complete their comments. And I want to see if anybody else has some comments they're bringing in from the breakout rooms in the meantime.
This is Linnell Ladd with K-State. I would ask, what are our plans, the group's plans for education for public institutions and industry going forward? How will we take the plan and amplify that to others?
Dorothy, would you like to speak to that?
Hi, Linnell. Great question. I was checking to see if anybody else was going to jump in. I think I can speak to the energy plan because Governor Kelly has announced that the state will undertake a statewide energy plan in 2020. Now, I have to say that was prior to COVID-19, and we haven't heard yet how the state's plan for an energy plan will change. But, we anticipate, that is something that will move forward. One of the things we've talked about as a group with our nonprofits that we work with through our WEALTH partnership, WEALTH is water, energy, air, land, transportation, and health, is that, we should get together as organizations and invite in, anybody else who wants to participate to start putting together a draft climate and energy plan. At this point, we don't have one. We have a lot of ideas, we have a lot of enthusiasm. And so, that's something that the WEALTH Partnership has talked about is, could we put together a draft that we would then circulate with others? And ultimately, it's going to take some leadership from the top, the governor and others to move forward with climate and energy planning, maybe the legislature. Through the Climate and Health Declaration that we talked about at resilientkansas.org, our idea was to get hundreds of organizations and thousands of Kansans to sign on, that to show the governor and other elected officials that we're concerned about climate. That message is beginning to resonate more with the work of the Metro Climate Action Coalition and others. That's a little bit of a long rambling answer, but the first step is getting you all contacted and engaged, so that we can put something together that we can do collectively.
I'd like to ask anybody else to join in and tell me a takeaway that you're walking away thinking about that was a new concept for you from this gathering.
Well, I might just say that I'm pretty inspired by this online communication here with Zoom, that we can still do a lot of good collaboration and sharing with each other. So that's pretty cool.
Hey, Zach, I wanted to also ask you, you spend a lot of time in the state capitol. So as a citizen, what can we do besides attend? Once a year we attend Wealth Day in February this year, for example, but what can our common citizens do to get the attention of our representatives and have some decent legislation that moves us more towards sustainability and this solve climate by 2030?
Yeah, good question, Jerry. I think it's very important right now, at any time, to introduce yourself, share your thoughts and feelings with your representatives and senators. That's what they're there for, is to hopefully echo the concerns of their constituents and try to make policy to make those things happen. I'd say the biggest thing right now is to get ready to vote. Get everybody you know ready to vote, because certainly climate, these issue areas are certainly on the ballot. So find out your candidates' views on these things by contacting them, issuing your thoughts, and at the end going to vote. And then after they vote, make sure that they know you're holding them accountable to some of those promises, and expect to work with them to make those things happen.
Another thing this is Mary Hill. Another thing I'm trying to do is not be so shy about talking to my relatives and friends and neighbors who don't agree with me, and not to be in their face about it, but basically my policy is if someone says something to me, I talk back. I don't just try to hide, or what felt to me like hiding. So, and it's produced some really interesting discussions. So I would really, if all we do is talk to people who agree with us, we're not going to make a difference. So, just a thought.
Yeah, good thought.
Well, our leaders in Iowa were hoping that at the end of these statewide conversations, we would be able to summarize for them, and the convening team will be sending them a report, what characterized Kansans' priorities with regard to developing a plan of action. What 3 ideas stood out as getting the most traction for the group that convened today. I'd like to hear from those of you who were in the breakout sessions, what seemed to be a dominant theme that you think would characterize a Kansas approach in 2020 to 2021. What was really standing out?
In the transportation group, a lot of it was important that we not forget the rural areas. We can't just focus on the metro areas. We have to focus on the entire state.
Mm-hmm. And that the rural areas are really attractive, actually. Living in kind of a rural lifestyle is attractive to a lot of people. But you have to have broadband. You have to have services.
In the energy and storage, we talked a lot about energy efficiency and housing, and making sure that it's not just for homeowners, it's for renters. And then also making sure that we're thinking about equity and how low-income folks who have a higher energy burden can take advantage of any type of energy efficiency programs going forward. We also talked a little bit about distributed generation, localized energy, but those were probably the 2 key takeaways.
I'm surprised Dorothy hasn't talked about the good news from the Kansas Supreme Court from last week.
And we did talk about that a little bit in our breakout room when we talked about solar. Yeah, Kansas Supreme Court sided in favor of distributed generation, solar, small wind can't be charged more by their utility. So that was great news for all of us.
And an opportunity for Kansas to go forward, both in the wind and solar direction. So I think that's a great incentive. We just need to get the word out. There's a lot of resources available here in Kansas to go forward with. Individual, house, each house could be equipped with something to do with solar now and wind. So yeah, definitely good news.
Mhm. So appropriately enough, given where we are, an emphasis on rural, on distribution, on locally available energy, sounds like a characteristic that Kansans could gather behind, with a rural emphasis, which the governor, of course, is emphasizing with her new center. So would anybody like to add one more thing before we are obliged to sum up the recording and report back to the people at Bard College? Any last comments that people haven't heard represented from their observations?
Hi,
Well, with
everyone.
that,
My name's Nick, and I'm with the
Please.
Solve Climate by 2030 group. And I just want to thank you all personally for being here tonight, and especially to our moderators and our speakers tonight. You all did a fantastic job. And this is just the first year that we'll be doing this, and we plan to do this more. So I hope that we can all see you guys again next year. And thanks again.
thank you.
Thanks for hosting.
I was going to pop in very quickly and say, I think that it's important that we're looking at this as across the board, all solutions. I think for too long we've looked for silver bullets. Well, if we just do this one thing or we just do that one thing. But I think that having a comprehensive plan that incorporates all sectors is going to be really vital, because if everybody is in it, then we'll actually get it accomplished.
Thank you, Carol. Well, with that, I want to thank Jerry for coordinating all of the technology to this, and for Larry Erickson in connecting us to Bard College, and for everybody who did such a marvelous job of hanging in there for a very productive 2.5 hours. Good work, everybody.
Can you put that last slide up, Donna? Didn't it have some resource information on there? There you go.
There we are.
Yeah,
Donna, thanks for moderating. You did a great job.
Sure. I'm learning. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Let me
everyone.
get that back.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Thank you.